Hey everybody, this is Shane Mata, and today I want to talk to you about a topic that popped into my head the other day as I was driving regarding the TV show Foundation, which is on Apple TV. It's on its second season. The third season's on its way. I guess it takes them a couple of years to make a new season. And so the show Foundation is based on the Foundation series of books by Isaac Asimov. And even these books are kind of at the tail end of the life of Demerzel. Demerzel is an android, and Demerzel is an assumed name. I forget the character's name, but Demerzel is supposed to be a dude. It's not a girl robot, or presents as male, I suppose. And in previous lifetime went by other names, which worked as a detective and some other things. The show's not about that. It's about psychohistory, where the whole show starts off with Harry Seldon, a professor that invented psychohistory. Here, let me just go kick this off here, which predicts the future of large populations, which in this case is empire, which is an empire of 10,000 worlds, let's say, and so they basically rule all of known civilization. And Harry Seldon has figured out with his psychohistory that humanity is headed for a dark age, that the empire is going to fall and humanity will fall into a dark age. And so his goal is to reduce the amount of time that it takes humanity to recover from that dark age. And so he starts kind of his foundation in an effort to store as much human knowledge and wisdom and all of that, so that they can reduce the impact of the dark age, shorten it. Now, psychohistory. What is psychohistory? And according to the story and what they described in the show, it's a combination of history, sociology, psychology, and mathematics. And so these are academic topics or subjects that you would study if you were to go to university or whatever. You'd study history or sociology, psychology. You'd study math, right? And This I think, in my opinion, is problematic in that it's a curated source of knowledge, because, with academic subjects, you do have to do research and you have to cite and you have to, but as we've seen in universities these past few years or past many years, there is a tendency for people to go into to have their biases go in a very odd direction sometimes. And so at some point, our universities in present day have become dogmatic in a lot of their beliefs. And if you go against what the universities teach, you're somewhat of a heretic, and then you must be cast out. So I think that's kind of the risk that we see here. So we'll discuss that a little bit more in this. So with relating to large language models, which are a version of machine learning, artificial intelligence, is that the way that psychohistory and LLMs are described is that they both rely on pattern recognition in vast data sets. So most AI training occurs by gathering all kinds of data. It's going to be, hold on, there's dogs outside. Okay, so as the name implies, for LLMs, they take a vast amount of language models or language with all kinds of writing, blog posts, books, articles, academic journals, all kinds of knowledge, and just stuff it into a model. And then based on the patterns that it sees, it's able to predict a response that you're searching for. So it's partly the data set produces certain responses, but also there is some magic that goes into creating the algorithms that is able to massage that data to bring a response to you that looks like, or it seems like magic, where the computer or the AI is answering your questions in a way that you were expecting. And that's, you're expecting it because you have a bias towards certain responses based on your experience, and so the data also has a bias towards those types of responses. And psychohistory is kind of the same way, is that based on what's going on in society, it is able to predict how humanity is going to, progress in the coming centuries or whatever. So LLMs are different from a database, in that a database can get you, 5 records that have this type of information on them, or find me all the files that have XYZ on them, things like that. Databases are only able to sort and retrieve records, whereas LLMs kind of predict a pattern based on another pattern that you feed into it. So the thing with this is that they both have limitations in their accuracy and the scope that they have, because a large language model, for example, would not have the capacity to help you out with video, or would not have the ability to help you out with photos or audio, things like that. So lately we've seen the development of multimodal AI, which is able to take the different types of input and give you different types of output. So you can ask it for a photo and it'll produce a photo based on your input. But that's not something that you would typically see in one large language model, because the language model is just one thing. So anyways, they're cobbling together all these different forms of AI into one product. And so we can expect that perhaps, it doesn't say in the books or in the show that, that psychohistory is multimodal, but we can presume that it is somewhat. So let's move on here. And I guess that's where we're going to talk about the accuracy and scope, is that we find that historical records are often biased towards the victors. There's that saying that, history belongs to the victor, because if you win the war, you get to write the history. But it's not just in battle that this is true. It's also in the war of ideas. Whatever war comes out, or whatever thought or bias wins the day, is the one that's going to write the academic journals or the articles, or publish the books, or will be taught in classrooms. So, for example, you might have a hard time finding classes nowadays in home economics, because that's fallen out of fashion lately. But that was something that was very useful to people, and it has been useful for the people who were able to take those classes. But because they're considered to be somewhat, sexist, I suppose, they're not taught anymore, even though you could benefit from learning how to manage your money, how to manage your resources at home, how to manage people, because that's really all it is. When you manage a home, you're managing people. All of these skills are translatable to other realms of your life, right? But because there's a bias against it, it's not, those things aren't taught anymore. In any case, so this way of history being biased towards the victor, it leads us to have some skewed, incomplete data for psychohistory. So politically, whoever's in charge would create the universities, right? And they would say what topics are going to be taught at the universities. And so that is going to affect history. It's going to affect sociology. It's going to affect mathematics and all kinds of topics that are taught at the universities. So right there you have a bias that's going into psychohistory. So as over time, as biases change, you can't rely that the data is going to be unaffected, because what the data says for one era may not apply to the next era. One example that we have today is for the Consumer Price Index, for example. This is government data on what it costs for household items, household goods. And they keep tinkering with this. And so they keep trying to reduce the CPI, Consumer Price Index, because if the CPI goes too high, then the government is on the hook for having to pay more out in Social Security and other benefits, for the cost of living adjustments. So they try to keep that as low as possible in order to avoid paying out, more every year. So they'll tinker with what is in the basket of goods that they use to evaluate the CPI. They'll tinker, different things in it. So you can't rely on the CPI from, let's say, 1950 to be the same as the CPI in 1960 or 1970 or 2020. It's going to be different. And so it's not an apples to apples comparison. It's a very vast difference between one and the other. So if we're talking about psychohistory in this example, then you can't rely that the data from one age is going to be the same data that's collected at another age, because the quality of the data may have changed, or the importance of the data may have changed, or there might be data that was no longer recorded and new data that was introduced. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. So that would taint or affect the data set for your psychohistory model. On the may perpetuate existing power structures and inequalities, I think that in any age is going to be, the establishment is always going to want to teach what it supports it. And so, that's another form of bias that's going to be introduced into your psychohistory model. Excuse me. Okay, so limitations of psychohistory missing voices. Another limitation is that of marginalized or illiterate groups. So you may have groups, for example, that have no writing. They may not have universities. Maybe they're outcasts and are not given a voice. How many great works have you heard from prisoners? You don't hear too many of those, other than like maybe the Gulag Archipelago, or something from somebody who's experienced prison and somehow got out and became an author. Excuse me. So a lot of these voices that are from marginalized parts of society, or groups that have no writing or other forms of literature, are going to be excluded because they have no way of recording their experience or their data or their what their life is like, and that therefore will not be included in the data set. And so you have an incomplete data set of what humanity as a whole is experiencing. You're only recording the data of those that are in power. And so if there was something, for example, that started off from the disenfranchised or marginalized, that ultimately wound up overthrowing the establishment. We see that today with the rise in populism, is starting to overthrow a lot of the establishment, and it's freaking some people out. But as you've witnessed in the news, is that there's all these claims of misinformation. They call it misinformation. When they don't agree with it, it's misinformation. And of course, the people that are disenfranchised or overlooked are basically calling it fake news, because they're not trusting what's being reported, because it doesn't represent their experience. So you can see where where psychohistory could have a problem differentiating between what is fake news and what is misinformation. when you're talking oftentimes about the same information just presented from two different viewpoints. So this is where the missing voices part of it is going to come in to affect the data set that feeds psychohistory. All right, now focus on official narratives. I think we spoke about that. So yeah, that's the part we were talking about misinformation. So the government has a vested interest in presenting information in a certain way because it supports them in their endeavor to keep control of the population. And therefore, what they present and record into the official record may not be representative of what is actually happening. Another thing that may not be included in psychohistory is oral traditions or other forms of passing on knowledge from one generation to the next. So, grandma's recipes or scrapbooks, for example, that's history. It's passed on from generation to generation, but there's nobody to record it in any official capacity. So that is left out of the psychohistory data set. And there's also oral traditions, which often are stories passed on verbally from one generation to the next. So we have traditions, oral traditions that eventually became the Bible, or that became stories that were, that we hear from Native Americans or from other parts of the world that were eventually written down. Like the Brothers Grimm, for example, took a lot of, I guess you would call them fairy tales, and wrote them down into a book. And so we have those books or those stories recorded, but because they went out and decided to write these things down. But there's a lot of oral history or tradition that may not make it into the official record. And so that is left out as well. Okay, let's see. Dark Age is characterized by a decline in record keeping. That's another thing is if you do enter into a dark age, and this is by definition, a data void. It's a time when there is no record or very little record keeping. And so it doesn't mean that nothing happened. It's just that the mechanism for recording what was happening has degraded. And so therefore there's limited knowledge about what happened in that day. So if you're a journalist and then you don't write stories for a few days, that period in which nothing you didn't write anything, it's a void. You don't know. You might remember immediately after, but over time it'll just be forgotten, and it's going to be a mystery what happened on those days that you missed. So dark ages in general, especially for psychohistory, which combines all of this data from all over, would create a dark age, or would create a problem for the model because it has incomplete data from which it can draw a conclusion or predict something. Okay, so how would we improve psychohistory? Now, this is the dangerous part because we have seen how Google tried to do it. Is they put in a lot of effort up front to try to be more diverse in the data that they put into their AI model, into Gemini. So we saw the ridiculous results that they came up with as far as creating images of George Washington being other than George Washington, things like that. Is that they made a concerted effort to eliminate the biases in the data, but they wound up biasing the data to do things that were just ridiculous. So they created their own sets of hallucinations because they wanted to not have certain results. So they wound up tainting the data or the models to create the results that they wanted, not recognizing that it wasn't an accurate representation of what the data was supposed to predict, right? And so you can try to fix it, but in trying to fix it, you may end up introducing more errors. So we have to be careful with that. So if we could fix it, how would we do it? Obviously, we would try to incorporate more diverse data sources. For example, instead of just the academic stuff, we would put in newspapers, we would put in romance novels, comic books, make it multimodal. Try to bring in all kinds of other topics, archaeology, for example, or even, fashion. Fashions change based on what's going on in the world. So, if there's shortages of clothing, then you're not going to use these big billowy amounts of cloth. You're going to be more economic in the use of your materials, for example. So you can use more data than what is available just in academic settings. You would also need to acknowledge the data gaps and the limitations of the data. Just when you're presenting your predictions, let it be known that there is some error possible because there's a gap in knowledge in a certain subject or field or experience. So, if based on all of these separate situations, you have you predict that people are going to go to war, there may be some instances in which people didn't go to war, but we don't have complete data to show that the conclusion was wrong. I'm not sure I'm explaining that correctly. The discussion on developing more flexible models, I don't recall what we were chatting about in that respect, but it does need to kind of be, I think it would have to be more of a what if scenario type of thing. I don't think we can rely on psychohistory to just say this is it. We could say, well, what if I did this and what if I did that? Then of course situations might change. And so having multiple courses predicted might be a better way of doing it, because then at least you would have humanity have a better chance of choosing their path, especially if it's going to be somewhat unavoidable. Now, in the case of Foundation, the problem that Harry had is that Empire did not want to believe that their powers was gonna end. They were completely opposed to the idea and did not want to hear it. So there was only so much that they could do to prevent anything from happening. So that's why he had to do this on his own and create his foundation to try to stave off the Dark Age. But if it were up to humanity as a whole, then we could have options and then use that as a way to decide politically which course we're going to take. And so I think that's where the flexible models comes in. And we should also try to make an effort to analyze data for biases. And I think this is going to be the tougher one, because we all want to believe that we're not biased. And we saw that with Google trying to make their data set or their models unbiased, they introduced some horrible biases. So I think addressing biases has to become more of a science, and that way we can be better at curating data that goes into the models that we use to predict things, and particularly in psychohistory. I think with flexible models, I think we might have also included things like, making it multimodal, so you can introduce photographs, videos, movies, all that sort of thing. Okay, psychohistory is machine learning. So, and I've alluded to this the whole time, is that psychohistory shares core principles with machine learning. It's basically the same thing, except, I suppose Asimov was ahead of his time when he conceived psychohistory. But the reality is, the way that large language models work is largely based on kind of the same concept of gathering large volumes of data and then using that data to predict things, predict what would you call it? Patterns, trends. Now, let's see. They both focus specifically on predicting the future of human society. I don't know if machine learning is about predicting the future of human societies, but it does predict what we expect from it. It feeds us what we want, and we want it because that's what we expect the answer to be such, and so based on human experience and the way we've recorded it, it gives us the answer that we expect it to be, more or less. So we're not completely surprised that it answers us. We're just surprised that it answers us so eloquently and well thought out. But the reality is that people have thought these things out many, many times over and over, and it's just spitting out the results of it. So I don't know. I don't think AI or machine learning is there yet, but I think that's ultimately a possibility in the future. And let's see, it says it can be seen as a specialized form of predictive modeling, and so that we've alluded again to this throughout the whole presentation. Multimodal psychohistory. So in the books, Asimov didn't really define what data they used. It just said that it used subjects, like history and sociology, blah, blah, blah. But it didn't say that it was just text. It didn't say that they included lectures or videos or, oral histories. It didn't say exactly what was included. So we could potentially incorporate multimodal inputs to help the models predict the course of human events, because I think if it is able to predict trends in society, based on our TikToks, for example, it's able to see a trend in our moral fabric, for example, then it can predict that it will vote a certain way, and therefore then we'll get certain results from government, and we'll become either more, what would you call it? More draconian or more liberal in the way that we govern ourselves. So I think adding multimodal data to the model could help in that regard. And also, of course, not only enhance the understanding and also improve the accuracy of the predictions that the model is giving us. All right, so conclusion. So you made it this far. I congratulate you. Thanks for sitting through this. This is something that I was thinking about, and like I said, and it's I wasn't completely happy that psychohistory was thought to be this flawless thing in the story, because clearly it isn't, and there are things that Harry Seldon could not predict with his model that surprised them eventually, and so therefore, you can put a lot of that into. For one, you can't predict what one person's going to do, but also is that the data can be deceptive. There's biases in it that can't tell you everything that can happen. So it is a compelling vision of predictive modeling, and it does share a lot of similarities with the machine learning. But I think in putting this in a story, Isaac Asimov has basically given us an idea of the challenges and possibilities of predicting the future. So right now, it's only the LLMs and other machine learning services are only giving us discrete predictions or discrete results. They're not giving us an analysis of greater things like social movements or anything like that, because I think the models aren't that big. They're not excuse me, they're not that full, and I don't know that we could create a prompt well enough to have it comb through all of human knowledge and deduce that so-and-so is going to win the presidential race this year, for example. I think it's just beyond that, because there's too many variables, and I don't think we've recorded enough. Quite frankly, we've only had this information explosion, in the past few decades. All the data that we've produced in just this year alone is probably more data than we produced in, many centuries in the past. So there's not enough clean data to give us an accurate model. So maybe in the future we'll have enough data to be able to predict such things, and machines will be quantum and they'll be able to crunch the numbers and give us much better predictions. But for now, we're not there yet. But I did want to raise it towards that end. I did want to raise the important questions about data bias and then the limitations of the data, and in creating something similar to psychohistory, which, as I've attempted to establish here, is basically a more advanced form of machine learning that we're experiencing now in these days, in this modern age. So I think that's the end of the slides here. So I do thank you for listening, and I appreciate you kind of bearing through these thoughts of mine. Thanks for watching.